Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new Demystifying post-production with Dustin Valkema and myself. Hi, Dustin. How are you?
Oh, I'm pretty good. I can't see your video. Is your video on?
It is. Yeah, I don't have a very good connection at home, so I hope that you can hear me. So
We can hear
anyway,
you fine.
I'm going to show my screen because that's most important. So it's week 3 of Demystifying post-production. Make your 3D render pop. And this time we're going to talk about how to add camera-like imperfection, depth of field, filters, and so on. You'll see all about it. And before that, we had the week 2 and week 1. You can find them on the Maxon Train Team channel. If you go to the streaming panel here. And last week we talked about 16-bit beauty render, so how to composite a simple render on, well, rather simple, on Photoshop, and how to make it pop. And just before that, we talked about the week before about the AOV, what AOV to use, in what case, and so on. And so today we continue on that with the imperfection Dustin is going to add. So of course we do have some stuff to give you. We have the free t-shirt and so on. So just check the comments. I'm going to paste all that very soon. And I'm going to hand over to Dustin, who is going to start the show. So go ahead, Dustin.
Sweet. All right, let's see. I can kind of wait till is my screen showing? Maybe not. I don't know. It's Monday.
Yeah, it is.
Awesome. There we go. All right. So yeah, so this week we're talking about imperfections. Just the kind of lens distortion, corrections. We're talking about chromatic aberration, grain, depth of field, things of that nature. And so if you have already downloaded the project files for the month, we're going to be using the Raptor Final Comp PSD file for this. And that's where we're going to jump off and start from. So before we actually get into the training side of this, I was curious, Lionel, what is your preferred go-to method for adding, or I guess more, what effects do you add to your renders in post? If you're talking like the imperfections, the camera, chromatic aberration, distortion, depth of field, what are your options? Like, what do you go to?
Well, you just named it about all of that. So it depends, actually. Very often now I do the depth of field inside Redshift because it's so fast and it looks good, and it's still compatible with all the AOV and so on. Even though you have depth of field, you can do AOV, it's no problem. But I still like to do it in post like you, because you can pick the focus, and sometimes it looks even better than actual depth of field. And then, of course, you said it, I'm always adding chromatic aberration, some vignettage. How do you say that? Vignettage? It's a French word, actually. Vignette, yes, vignette in French, vignettage. Vignette. So I always add some
that way. I like it.
Yeah, it sounds smarter, I guess. And sometimes some dirt on the lens. Not every time, but yeah, I always add stuff, and I like to do it all with Magibolic looks, which is unfortunately not available on Photoshop. So I'm curious to see how you're going to do it.
Cool. So where we're going to start today is working into, we'll say depth of field first. We could talk about that a moment, but we'll go into depth of field and then we'll move into lens corrections for the chromatic aberration. We can also talk about the distortion there as well. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time actually introducing camera raw. inside of Photoshop as a way to actually finish a lot of your renders. So I believe it was last week we talked quite a bit about getting it right in camera and what that means as a photographer and what that can mean as a 3D artist. At this point, where everything is kind of digital, including cameras, I really feel like there are a ton of connections between a photographer and a 3D artist. And both of those skill sets really play well off of one another. In fact, I feel like it's vital for a 3D artist to study photography and vice versa. I feel like, learning 3D has helped me a lot more as a photographer because it just offers a different perspective, and perspective is huge in creativity. So let's go ahead and start this off. So inside of the Raptor Final Comp PSD file, we're going to talk first about the depth of field. So when I'm doing depth of field, I like to do this prior to adding a bunch of effects and overlays, things of that nature, because a lot of that is going to impact the way the depth of field works. So if I have, say in this instance, I have a bunch of smoke and a bunch of, flames that are in the scene, maybe even these embers, those aren't going to be included in my 3D render pass for Z depth. And so a lot of times if you're, you may actually want to manipulate your depth pass to work with your overlays if you're starting to build them. We can discuss that a little bit here too. So let's start with the Z depth. So inside of Photoshop, I'm just going to turn off a few of my effects layers and we can just continue down. There we go. We'll just start with the base composite that I have here. What I'm going to do here is create a stamp visible layer. So that's Control or Command, Alt or Option, Shift plus E. And what that's going to do is create a layer here on top that is just a merge or stamped layer of everything visible. So with that being done, the first thing I'm going to do is right click and convert this to a smart object. And actually we'll undo that here for a moment. That's a little bit later. So we can name this layer depth of field. Now, with this one here, this is going to be my depth of field layer. So once I get everything done in my scene, as far as the base composite is concerned, I like to stamp and then create a depth of field pass. And then I'm going to start moving up in a few more stamp visible layers, especially once we get to the grading side and maybe making localized contrast adjustments. So there's quite a bit that we're covering today. Hopefully it all makes sense and comes together quite well. So with the depth of field, in order to add a depth to it or a Z depth, we're going to need to have our Z depth pass. And this is going to need to be an alpha. So currently, when I set this up, I just threw it in there as alpha 1. We can rename this to Z. And from here, we can head up to filter, blur, and then we'll see that we have a lens blur option here. So this is what we're going to use for the depth of field. And maybe not have my alpha channel selected. We'll head back up to RGB. There we go. And we can repeat. And lens blur. Okay, so it looks pretty crazy at the moment. So the first thing that you're going to want to look at once you get into the lens blur box here, let me hide my stuff on the bottom, there we go, is going to be your depth map source. Currently, we have this set to Y+. This is what I used when I was creating more of a pop on the top of, the top normals. Talked about that last week. We're going to head down to Z, or whatever you're naming your Z depth pass, that's what you're going to want to use here. Now, with depth map source being at Z, we have a set focal point. This is going to allow us to click anywhere in our scene here and set this focal point. So there are a few things to take note of while you're starting to work with this. And that is, for me, the timing at which you're doing your Z depth, because it's a little bit different than, say, if you're in something like Nuke, Fusion, maybe. I haven't used Fusion as much, but if you're a nuke, you can shuffle all of these passes out and kind of reuse and manipulate them at will, and then plug them into other nodes as you're building masks. Photoshop, as we saw last week, and even in week 1, is quite a bit different, where these adjustments that you're making to your main image aren't going to apply to all of the masks that you've created. So you may want to go back in and apply this to things like maybe a copy of your Z-depth mask and some of the other channels that you've created. So once you do this, your channels aren't going to work the same. So just keep that in mind. That's why I like to do this after my base comp is done, prior to adding a bunch of different effects. Like I said, we'll cover some of that in a little bit here. So after we set our focal point right on the eye of our raptor here, we can adjust this and maybe click on one of the background buildings, and we'll see that it's actually doing a pretty good job here. And I'm just kind of waiting for it to update. Every time I click, we'll click back on the raptor. So this is a really good, obviously, way of going about adding Z depth. We can change things like the iris, the radius, blade curvature. The focal distance here is going to be set by the 1 point that we're clicking. The radius down in the iris is going to control the amount of blur that we have. This is really important when it comes to understanding what lens you're using. So if I'm rendering this, I forget exactly what this was, might have been like a 24 millimeter lens. If I'm rendering at a 24 millimeter lens, I'm not going to have a ton of compression. So doing something like a radius of 88 might not really make sense. Like, this is going to really truncate and make this raptor look super tiny, and that may not be the result that we want in the end. So understanding your lenses, even at a base level, and what compression does to the amount of blur that you have in your shot is going to be huge. Of course, you can always go in and be a bit more creative. Once you understand the fundamentals, then you can kind of creatively explore. Yeah, there we go. You can explore from there. So we can take this, and maybe we'll do a radius of maybe 40 so that we can see this pretty well. There we go. Now, with this, we can also start to adjust our specular highlights and things like this. We don't have any like twinkly lights or anything in the background, so this might be a little bit more difficult to see. If you have a shot that has nice metallic reflections and kind of small, maybe LED lights, you can really start to tune in your bokeh at this point and get some cool looks. We can add a nice amount of noise here. We'll just kind of turn this up. So when I'm working with depth of field, most of the time, I am only focused on depth of field. I don't like to add noise at this point. I generally like to work with noise in 2 separate layers. So just, if you want to do it the way that I do it, don't use the noise so much here. Now, are there any questions now that we're in here?
Not yet.
Okay. So that's really the way that we add depth of field. It's using the Z-depth mask as a channel. So even if you have it as a layer, as a render layer, you actually want to create a channel of that, rename it to something that you'll recognize once you get in and start to work with your source. But this is how you would go about doing the Z-depth. Now, we also do have the option. I don't know how well this is going to work, and I realize I just canceled that, which is totally fine for this case. As we're starting to, do our renders, maybe we didn't actually set up the Z-depth. So we talked a little bit about it prior, where we can head up to filter, neural filters, and we're going to have the depth map as soon as it picks up here. I need some cool elevator music as we start to wait for certain things to load. So we have our depth blur. So if we turn this on, this is going to be very similar, but not nearly as precise as what we had just done. So as we saw in previous weeks, this actually does a pretty good job here. We can click to place our focal point and let that update. That can give us a nice kind of similar result to using the Z-depth pass and the lens blur right from our effects menu. So we can talk for a moment about when to and when not to actually have a depth of field, because this is a question I get a lot. And there's really no perfect answer. It all has to do with your preferred workflow. Like, I actually prefer using the Redshift depth of field with custom bokeh textures and just rendering things in place when I'm doing kind of personal projects, or I'm doing freelance projects that I know aren't going to really need to be changed. And a lot of that has to do with understanding your client, first of all. And then, like, if you're not sending these files to somebody else, then a lot of times you can get away with just rendering and baking in your depth of field, working with the beauty pass and so on. So just keep in mind, when you're baking in the beauty in your render, you can't really adjust it. But the benefits is that every single mask and every render layer that you kick out is going to have that depth applied. So what we have just done, and let's go and apply our blur here, since I canceled it last time. I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about and why this can be a headache if you apply depth of field at what I would consider to be the wrong time. So we have a radius of 50. We can boost this up even further just for the moment. And we can click OK. All right, so now we have an unblurred. We have our depth of field with a blurred background. And say our client comes back and they're like, hey, we want to, I don't know, make the background buildings quite a bit darker. And that generally would be pretty easy to do. And so if we have that, let's say we'll just do it from, I'm not sure if I even have the mask in here. We'll go into our accessory layers, learned about these last week, and we will grab the buildings. Okay, so for these buildings, controller command, I'm going to click the two red and green thumbnails holding shift. So it's going to select everything. We can apply that selection to an alpha, and we'll call this one buildings. There we go. So with that being done, we can hide these layers now. I'm just going to keep the selection that we have, and I'm going to bring in a curves adjustment layer. This is what I like to use most of the time when I'm adjusting the values in things. And even if we don't want to adjust the color, we just want to say change the blend mode to luminosity. This is going to allow us to start dropping the value of these. Looks pretty cool, can help our Raptor pop a little bit in certain areas. But as we start to zoom into this, you can see that now, like I said, none of these adjustments are actually being placed, or the blurred adjustments are being placed on any of these extra layers. And so we have to remember to go in and do that for every one of the layers that we're going to need to adjust. So the filter under blur and then the lens blur that we used can't really be a smart filter. So what that means is that if we right click and create a smart object of our depth of field layer, we head back to blur, you'll see that lens blur is blurred out or grayed out. And so this is why it gets tough to do this in post in Photoshop, because this is going to just, it's a destructive workflow, right? We can't change this later. So what's cool is that if you're looking for a very basic blur using the depth blur from the neural filters, those neural filters can be smart filters. And so you can go back and adjust and tweak those as needed. So just keep note of that. We'll just Control Z and get back to our depth of field here. So how do we apply these adjustments to other things, right? So right now we have our buildings. What we can do is head up to filter, and then we can press on the lens blur again, give that a moment, and we'll see that now we're going to be able to get the blurred adjustment. And this is what we can then use for our mask. The hard part about this is that once you close your Photoshop document, you're not going to have that option for the lens blur to be applied again. So if you're starting to add this depth of field, this is kind of why I like to do it last. And on its own layer at that. I don't like to merge all of my layers and bring those in because it just gets to be very destructive. So if you can do it in the render, there are times where getting it right in camera can definitely be great. So my general workflow is to work with my clients and kind of train them. You call it client education, right? Like you train them on your process. So when I'm starting a project, we'll say product rendering, I like to go through certain stages where my camera, lighting, all of that stuff, even the depth of field, everything's locked in before I move on to materials, before I move on to rendering, and before I move on to post. So that way I can start to know exactly, what's able to be done, right? Like I don't want to get to this stage and have everything done and be through post and have my clients say, hey, we want to change the camera angle. So work with your clients, get these things like set in stone before you move on different parts of the pipeline. And yeah, so it looks like we have a question. Let's see, Anderson.
Yes, Anderson asking, is it possible to create a fog from the depth path? So yes, of course, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah. I think we'll have time for that today. We did talk about this, I believe it was last week, in creating kind of an atmospheric perspective for that. But we didn't actually talk about maybe ground fog and how you can add some of that stuff. So let's do it. I'm going to delete that curves layer because we've already been through that. We can select our Z depth pass from our channels. And of course, see, I almost got myself. We're not going to have the actual blur in the Z depth. So if we look at our Z depth pass, we can see that this is all, too far out. There we go. We can see that all of these edges are sharp, and we're not going to want that. So what we'll do is we can just drag our Z depth pass down to the little plus box here, create a new alpha, and then we can apply the lens blur. There we go. We can apply those lens blur adjustments to that. And this is kind of what I was talking about, where you're going to have to double some of these things once you have your Z depth locked in here, because you can't make adjustments like that very easily. So there are ways around it. You can always get close to, depending on what type of adjustments you're making. But just work smarter, not harder, and kind of like build yourself backup systems. So we'll do Z depth, blurred. So that way we know what we have. And with this channel, we can Control or Command, click on the thumbnail here to create a selection, head back up to RGB, and then we can create, let's say, we'll just do a solid color again here. So with the solid color, say we want something a little bit more foggy. Click OK. And now we have our fog in our scene. So the way that I like to work with this, I talked about it a little bit in previous weeks, we can drop our opacity slightly. So even if we want that fog to really be filling up the scene and the environment, we have a lot of negative space and a lot of dead space up top in the sky area. So we can set this to something like 80%. We'll see that that's still quite heavy. We can drop that a little bit lower just to where we're starting to see some of these details here from the background. And now at this point, if we want to adjust how deep the fog is going, we're going to have to adjust the values of this layer mask. So inside of the layer mask, we can hold down the Alt or Option key and click on our layer mask icon here. And once we get into the layer mask, we can use something like levels or curves to start to adjust this point as to where this is going to be, how thick the fog is going to be, and kind of push that away towards the background of our subject. So we'll do something maybe like this, and we can actually brighten up the back here just a little bit as well. So of course, just like most alpha channels, the white areas are where the fog is going to show, the black areas are where it's not. And we can click OK, click back into our color swatch icon here, And there we have fog. So the other way that I like to use fog is actually with a gradient sometimes, rather than just throwing a solid color adjustment layer in there. So that allows us to get a little bit more of, say, like a ground fog kind of effect, and then build that up as we move. So with this one here, we can select our Z blurred channel again. And now, instead of solid color, we can head to a gradient, and we can already see the adjustment here and how that's going to work. So that gradient is now going to allow us to move and position this gradient wherever. I feel like that red actually looks pretty sweet. So yeah, that's kind of how it's done. You can also paint in various things, say like if you wanted noise. The way that I've worked with this in the past quite a bit is I will grab a brush, something like a smoke brush. So I have a custom smoke brush that we'll use for this one. And what we can do is actually use this smoke brush, maybe drop our flow down quite a ways because we don't want that to be too heavy. So now we can just go ahead and use this and create kind of some noisy breakups. So it might be a little bit too hard to see. I can see it fairly well on my side. We'll bring it up to somewhere like 70. And we can see the difference here as we start to look in. You can create some nice bits of breakup there. So a very easy way to adjust that. And the cool part is that even though we've now painted on and adjusted this layer mask, we still have everything saved in our channels. So this is also, again, why building an alpha library is so important. Once you start to change things, it can be more of a hassle to go back into various layers, like our accessory layers, turn on our depth, recreate all of our, kind of our base pass. So with all of that being said, let me see where we're at here, because I have a handy dandy list that tells me the things that we have to cover. So we got to talk about the lens correction filters, and we'll talk about Oniric a little bit, and then we'll talk about camera raw. Okay. Sweet. See, we're doing good today.
I do have a question about the depth of field. Do you use other plugin than the one with the Photoshop external plugin?
I don't currently, because I've actually gotten much more used to rendering depth of field in to most of my projects. And when I don't need to render depth of field in, or if I need to not render my depth of field from Redshift, then I just use the Photoshop depth of field. It usually does the trick.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's the short answer on that one. There are plugins that can do it. Most times they'll never know. They'll never know. So, all right. Let's see. We talked about masks. Let's talk about the chromatic aberration and how to add some of those effects. So what we'll do is bring this layer down. We can actually delete the one. I think we can leave the red in here just because I think it looks cool. And we're going to do the same stamp visible hotkey that we did before. Control, Command, either one, Alt or Option, holding Shift, and then pressing E stamps everything that's visible together. So just a note, if you're doing that and you want to create a stamp visible layer, you can't do that if you're on an invisible layer. So just know that you have to create, like head up to the visible layer wherever you're at, and it'll stamp everything for you. So from here, we can name this one. So we'll call this one lens correction, and we can head up to our filters and then lens correction from here. So this is where I like to add generally chromatic aberration. I do a lot of these things in certain parts of the process, and then add the other effects later. So camera raw is generally where I like to actually add my vignetting. That's where I like to do a lot of my grain, so on and so forth. Even some of my lens distortion, if I need that. It just depends on like what I feel with the project. So just know that it's okay to use different, effects. Just because Photoshop has things to add noise and whatever, it may be okay to go into Camera Raw, which is obviously inside Photoshop as a filter, but we don't have to, stick with just the lens correction here. So inside of lens correction, we're going to head to custom. And from here, we'll see that we have our distortion that we can add or remove. We have the chromatic aberration vignette, and we can adjust the midpoint, transform it vertical, horizontal, so on. So for the chromatic aberration, red and cyan, I mean, you have it, you kind of see it here. I don't feel like I have to go in. I won't insult your intelligence, but you can move that slider one way or the other to get the right amount for you as to what, ever effect you want. So the way that I generally work, I like a lot of chromatic aberration, especially in my personal work, client work, sometimes not so much, just depends on what they need. So for me, we'll zoom into right into our Raptor here, and hopefully we can see this a little bit better. So my normal process, I take cyan and I just click somewhere towards 3/4 of the way up, and then I do the same for the green and magenta. Again, let's see, we'll take blue the opposite way. All right. So doesn't look like it's updated at the moment. Kind of waiting for it to pop up here. All right, or not. Let's see if we can reset. Head back in. Oh, is the preview checked off? that might actually be a good one. Oh, yeah, sure enough, all the way down here. I wonder when that happened. See? Good call. I appreciate that. Thought I was losing my mind for a minute. Anyways, we'll back up a little bit. Chromatic aberration. We'll just do a very harsh click on either side here and get a pretty good split. And so we can already see that that's working, especially here up at the top where we have the nice contrasting lines. We're getting quite a bit of a chromatic split. We can push that a little bit further. Maybe take the magenta and really push that. And now we can see it's working quite a bit further there. So with that being said, this is how we're going to do chromatic aberration. And what we'll see is that as we're adding the chromatic aberration, you are going to have some slight adjustments. And so again, it's kind of like everything else. If you start to work in stages, it's a lot easier to go in and add these effects again than do this like way at the beginning of your composite and then have to kind of dial back through a bunch of different layers. So I like to build on this as I start to move forward. Generally speaking, it's actually at a point where, say, I've already done my depth of field. We've put the various effects in, got all of this stuff done. Right before I go to grading is where I'll start to add some of that, camera correction and things of that nature. So, questions?
None yet. I'm surprised actually about the quality of the lens correction, and it's funny because you use a lens correction to add distortion.
Right. It's not always about correcting. Sometimes you want it, but yes, it's always how you use the tools. And yeah, I like the way that the lens correction works there. I'm actually going to reset my brush here just in case we do need it. But yeah, that's definitely one of the first ways that I'll add chromatic aberration. That's my first go-to. It adds a very nice kind of pop to the image. The other way that I like to do this is actually having the different channels split. So what that means, and we'll just consider, let's say, head to the top of our fire effects. We'll just go all the way up to the top here. There we go, digital flares. I'm going to create another stamp visible layer, and then we'll duplicate it. So we'll call this one maybe red, and this one blue, and we can create a group. You can definitely create an action for this that kind of do all of it for you. So we'll call this one CA for Chromatic Aberration. And then what we're going to do is actually use the blending options in our layer styles to give us specific channels for each of these layers. So we'll duplicate once more, and we'll go to green. So double click on the layer, and right inside of our blending options, we're going to head down to channels, and we're just going to leave the one channel checked for each of these individual layers. So this one's red, and for the blue one. So the cool part about this is that this allows you to really have control over each of the individual channels. So it can get a bit weird, but also a bit more creative. So for instance, we're going to take the green, we'll zoom in here a little bit, and with the brush tool or the move tool, we can hold down Control or Command and just use our keys, our left and right arrow keys, to kind of offset these channels. And so it can get wild. I'll mess this one up, and then we can just delete it after. But we can see we can get some really cool, like, kind of stereoscopic effects. Everything going on here. Like, this is a pretty harsh split. But if you start to work with these and then even transform those layers a little bit differently, let's see if I can undo. Is that back to normal? There we go. I haven't done this quite a bit in more of my late work, but what I used to do is actually take these, and we can hold down the Alt or Option key and then Shift, and we can transform this sideways. And we can do the same maybe with the green channel. Kind of split that off. Looks like it's going to snap. There we go. So we can actually split this in one particular direction. So all of that being said, a lot of cool effects, two ways to do it, and probably the two most common ways that I actually do this. Once you're starting to work with the chromatic aberration, layer masks can be your best friend. So just like we did with the lens correction down on the bottom here and creating some chromatic aberration, we can do it on this group specifically. But say you have a product that's, in your scene, and you want a nice chroma split, kind of as it gets to the edges towards the outside, of your frame. That's really easy to do here. We can just add a layer mask, maybe use a soft round brush, and we just paint black in the areas that we don't want those effects to take place. We can just click here in the middle, and we can see how that's working now. Now, of course, this is a little bit wild, like way more chromatic aberration than I would actually add. But you can definitely add those effects and remove them from certain parts of your image. So yeah, I think that's that works pretty well. Sorry, I'm reading the comments at the same time here.
I really like the way Photoshop you can just paint anything you want. It's so much easier than the other software. This is the one thing I think Photoshop is the best.
Yeah, it definitely has it's a blessing and a curse, right? Like every software, every tool does things, in its own way. And so, I like a lot about Nuke and Fusion, even After Effects, but I also love the simplicity sometimes of just popping it into Photoshop. You can work dirty and just paint certain masks and get things out of there. So, Thomas, is that the fire and smog brushes? Actually, yes. These are the CG Hacks fire effects and smog overlays. You can check them out, yeah, on the website. I think there's we have a coupon code that if you actually want to go and purchase those, we can post that link down. We have a pretty cool drop coming on Friday, so check those out. And yeah,
done.
Shameless plug. But we do have our spring sale coming on Friday, so if you guys all want to wait, take a look there.
I like
so go ahead.
I like the comment from Ricky Sharp. Photographers often go to great length to remove chromatic aberration. Fun to see it being added back in. And yes, when I was a photographer too, we could spend a lot of money to have a glass without any chromatic aberration. And when you do 3D, we put them all over because we have perfect lens, too perfect.
Right.
Actually.
Well, and it's funny because, you know, personally, like my preferred style of work is gritty. You know, I like to have the imperfections and chromatic aberration, lens grime, whatever it is. I like it to look even sometimes past like realistic, a little bit more surreal. But it is funny because, you know, as photographers, when, you know, I spent a lot of time as a retoucher, and you're just sitting there and painting out all of these textures and all the little micro imperfections, and I was just like, just leave it. It looks great. Like it's perfect. So yeah, we always add it back in when we're talking 3D. It is fairly rare that like you won't add any of that, but even just a little bit, just like 1 pixel, just shift it a little bit. It'll help. Okay, so any other questions or comments that we need to take in here?
I think we're fine.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we've talked about the correction. We can talk about some of the lens effects. Sorry, like the bloom and glare type of effects. So I personally use Composite Nation, Oniric plugin, and I think I might have had a link for that. You can just head to the website here and kind of share this. So this is what I use for all of my bloom and glare in Photoshop. Photoshop often gets weird when I'm streaming, so I'm not sure if we can really go into crazy detail and like use it. We can try. We'll see if we can break Photoshop. That's fine. But this is definitely my favorite, you know, set of plugins. The way that I like to work with bloom and glare in Photoshop. It's fast. It's easy. Fairly cheap. They are throwing a sale right now, so you can definitely get this at a bit lower of a price. Normally, it's I believe $129 USD. So yeah, it's awesome. Check it out. Oniric from Composite Nation. Looks like I was on BreakGen, but either way, there we go. There it is. So all the pretty glows, bloom, glare. The only reason I will say that I don't render my bloom and glare from right inside of 3D generally has to do with the fact that it's only going to be baked in. So personal projects, bloom and glare, I may render that in every now and then. I like to have the ability to tweak it in post. And currently, Redshift doesn't just kick out a lens effects render pass. That would be amazing, but you can deal with multiplying, or I think it's subtracting the beauty from, I don't know. You have to set it up. I forget how it works now because I haven't done it in so long.
That's it. You're going to get your beauty, then you have to recreate everything with the AOV, and then just subtract the two of them. So it's long and complicated.
Yeah, and so I don't do that anymore. I use Oniric. And this is just in Photoshop. If you're using After Effects, 100% use use Red Giant and make that happen. So okay, last thing here is going to be talking about Camera Raw. So I love Camera Raw. It allows you to do a lot of things. If you're a photographer and you are familiar with Lightroom, it's pretty much like Lightroom inside of Photoshop that allows you to color grade, sharpen, add different details, so on. The reason why I like using Camera Raw so much is that if I have a render that looks nice out of the box, especially when I'm doing product renders, for something like this, that's a bit more of a composite, there's a lot of work that I'm doing to build the overlays and get all of these things to look right. On the product side, if I'm rendering out a nice, beautiful environment or just kind of closer up macro, e-commerce shots, things like that, Camera Raw can really make everything pop. And it could almost be like a go-to solution. And you can also save your presets. Yeah. So yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. Buying plugins and whether they're Maxon like Red Giant, Magic Bullet, things like that for After Effects or Photoshop side, Composite Nation, like the tools that you're using that save you time ultimately save you far more money than the time it would take to actually create a lot of the effects that give you the same results. So I used to spend hours for years, like painting custom effects, the bloom, the glare, the glows, the nice light fall offs. And then Composite Nation came out with Oniric and it completely replaced hours of my workflow. So yeah, Camera Raw, let's talk about that. We're going to create a stamped visible layer on top of everything like we had before. Now, the difference with this stamped visible layer, especially once I get to grading, there are times where I like to use different masks when I'm grading. So I can grade the background independently of the subject or the midground plane and so on. And so I'll actually use this as a smart filter so I can make adjustments as I go. So we can right click, convert this to a smart object, and we'll call this grade 1. We can just bring this all the way up to the top. And now we can hold down the Control or Command, Shift, and A, and that's going to open up our Camera Raw. I call it a program. I mean, it's a program, but also a Photoshop filter. And so it's like its own Lightroom inside of Photoshop, and it's amazing. So you have quite a few different tabs here. I'm just going to close basic and kind of give like a crash course or like overview on what you really need to know inside of here. All right, so obviously auto, we have an auto button. We know what that's going to do. Automatically try to make the adjustments for us. I very rarely use that. Black and white is going to turn everything black and white. Very rarely use that. Okay, so we have the profile, monochrome or color. These are all things that I'm not generally touching when I get here, but knowing where they're at. There have been times where I've actually done black and white renders for clients, and I have to start changing some of these different things. So just knowing about that. Basic is going to be your white balance. We'll just call it white balance overall, and a lot of your lighting adjustments. We're very used to working with exposure, contrast, and so on. When it comes to the details, if we move down a little bit further here, this is where I start to really get into enjoying Camera Raw and working in this space specifically. So your texture is going to take your texture details quite a bit higher. Maybe I can zoom in here just a little bit. There we go. And we'll see what's happening as we're, working. It's just kind of like those even medium and larger details, like it's really making those pop. Texture is a little bit different than clarity. So this is where you're adding contrast like to your midtones with the clarity, and it can give you some really nice kind of sharpening effects to your image. So you're adjusting the contrast in your midtones. Always, I won't say always because there's people that are going to want to do this anyway. Locally, be very careful with how you're starting to use your clarity specifically, because you can get a lot of artifacts, things like halos, like photographers renders are usually a little bit more clean, so we can get away with certain things there. If you're talking photography, like I've had plenty of times where I've gotten such harsh halos from using clarity, because it's just adjusting those midtones. And so when you're adding that contrast, you're going to get this little haloed edge. I'm trying to see if we can actually get a good example of this to where it crunches in pretty bad.
It's a good example why photographers are going to buy very expensive glass, because the clarity is going to enhance the chromatic aberration, and we don't have that problem because it's perfect, so you can go almost crazy with the clarity. I'm surprised to see that 100 it's still pretty good.
Yeah, it's actually not bad. I'll kudos to whoever put this thing together. But
on the fire,
yeah, maybe. So clarity is great. It's a good effect. Excuse me. It's a good effect. I like it for most things. I like it for enhancing the areas of my image that I want enhanced. Okay. I don't always want to have a full clarity. And like you can see even in the back here, I know I'm pointing at it, but you can also see my mouse. So that's good. But in the back here, like these are areas that I would want to actually sometimes even like reduce the texture or the clarity, and push the focus away from those areas a bit more. So we'll talk about masking here in a moment. So clarity, I usually like to do this even in photography. I use clarity locally in specific parts of my image and not just plaster it over the entire thing. So your curves are just like curves that we're used to. You're able to go in and adjust various points in your different channels here as well. The details, so the sharpening is going to be your sharpening. Now, let's zoom in a little bit. A lot of times you can want to go and completely blast this and make it a lot sharper. I like to do bits of sharpening with my clarity. And so that's going to like visually sharpen and enhance things before I get to actually sharpening the image itself. Now, the biggest part about sharpening here is that you may not want to just use obviously 150, but we may not want to sharpen every little thing. Like we can see some of these edges here where our masks were off. We talked about how to fix that, but it's still a little bit odd. And so you may not want to actually sharpen all of these details. So the way that you go about masking, how you're sharpening, is by using the masking slider. Now, you don't actually see anything. We're going to zoom in just a little bit. You don't see anything until you hold the Alt Option key and then move your slider. So it's a little bit tough to gauge exactly where and what you're actually masking to. So it'll find the edges for you. Hold down the Alt Option key. We can see that we can reset certain things here from the rest of our drop downs. Hold down Alt Option, and then we can click and drag the slider. It's going to show us essentially the layer mask of where the sharpening is going to occur. And then we can apply that to the area that we want to have. So definitely a very easy way to go about this. I feel like I keep clicking and zooming in and out. I'm sorry if anybody has an issue with that. So next we move on to the color mixer. So color mixer is going to be very similar to, say, a color balance. In Photoshop, you can adjust the hue, saturation, or just the amount of various colors that you have, and super easy to work with. It's really quite self-explanatory. As you're starting to work with the specific points, in the hue and saturation, we can target specific colors. So in this case, we can click our little target adjustment, and we can start to come on here. Oh, and it might actually, I think mine's bugged. So you can usually target there pretty easily and get that to work well. So luminance, I will talk something about luminance here. Luminance is one that I like to use more often than saturation to get things to pop well. So for instance, the glows that we're having, I'll start adjusting the values first before I start going into the saturation, because they all play hand in hand. And so I'll adjust values before I move up into the saturation, and oftentimes even before I go into the hue and make adjustment back and forth. So with that being said, let's close down the color mixer, and then we can get into the color grading. Color grading is going to be the color wheel setup. So if you're I think this, what is it, Illumetry color in Premiere? If you're used to color wheels, this is going to allow you to adjust your shadows, midtones, and highlights, and each of these independently. So in the final composite, this is pretty much how I did it. I went in and was able to start adding some of these various colors, and they all work out well. Now, again, the Alter Option key is kind of like a magic key that not too many people know about. I mean, like if you're new to Lightroom, if you're new to Camera Raw, you may not really know that it's going to be there. So holding down Alter Option, we can do things like adjust our balance. So adjusting this balance is going to allow us to see a fully saturated version of the colors that we have. So for instance, we can take our blue for our shadows, and we'll go maybe red for our highlights. And then midtones, we can set somewhere, we'll say maybe in green. Now, if we hold down the Alter Option, and we'll see that we have the ability to see the ranges of each of those colors as we're starting to adjust the balance here. Now, if I let go of the Alter Option, this is going to be a little bit different. We have it pretty saturated, so it still looks like the colors are there, but it's definitely different between the balance. So color grading. Let's reset these. There we go. Just double clicking on either the sliders or those points to reset them. Now it looks like we still have one. There we go. Reset the balance. All right. So in our optics, this is going to be where I will start to add various bits of distortion. I don't like to go too far with it, just personally. Yeah, there's not really a whole lot more to say about that. I just don't like to add too much distortion where it's not needed, unless it's a creative thing for me personally, and then I can move from there. We have the ability to add vignetting here, so we can go darker with it. We can also increase this to a brighter point. And if we twirl down the little triangle, this is going to allow us to adjust our midpoint here, and where that midpoint is going to sit. We can add that all the way, and we'll see what that looks like feathered in and out. All right, so geometry, this is going to be transforming and, you know, all of that. I don't really like to do that as much. It's kind of more of a thing that I might do in a photo versus an actual render. Down in the effects, this is where we have our grain. So I like the grain in Camera Raw quite a bit more than just adding noise in Photoshop. So a lot of times I like to work on two separate layers. I don't feel like we have to show this because we've shown a lot about how to work with these different layer masks and so on. But what I like to do is create two different layers. I'll have a heavier grain for my shadows, and then I'll have a somewhat lighter and maybe slightly smaller grain for my midtones on their way up to the highlights. So I don't like to have grain in the brightest parts of my image, only as it goes down towards darker. And I'll create two layers pretty much like this before I even get to grading. And those are going to be how I'm going to add all of that grain in, and the, what is it called? My brain is gone for the moment. So blend diff, that's what it is. So I'll use blend diff on those layers to remove them from the brighter parts of the image at two different values. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know, leave a comment if it makes sense. If not, I can show that. So the calibration down at the bottom, this is one thing that I don't really adjust in my renders almost at all. There are times if I absolutely have to, but I wouldn't worry about this so much. In your renders, I don't think it's really going to matter. So moving on to masking, we are talking about local adjustments. I'm going to reset my grain here because that's a bit crazy. There we go. Let's talk about the local adjustments and how to make the raptor specifically pop here in the scene. So our mask icon is going to be the circle with the little dots in the middle. You can obviously hover. I feel like I need to turn off my tooltips because this is coming in way too often here. Now, inside of our masking options, we can automatically select different objects, the subject, sky, background, and so on. And this is going to allow us to just click on subject. And then almost instantly in this case, if you're using 16-bit renders, it can take just a little bit longer in most cases. But we can see that we have most of our raptor selected. So if I zoom in here just a little bit, you'll see that there's pieces on the shoulder. The mouth has a few odd areas. It's kind of like doing an automatic selection in Photoshop, which is totally fine most of the time. We can add to or subtract from this mask using things like a brush and so on. In this case, we're not really going to focus on it too much. And so we can turn the show overlay off, knowing that we have this one mask selected. And now we can head down to the effects for this mask and then boost our clarity. And now we can see that our clarity is only affecting our raptor. And now what we can do is start to build this up into different layers if we want to take that time. Or we can just paint on this mask and we'll say add maybe a brush, okay? And let's see, new brush. It looks like it is not going to the brush here. I've actually been dealing with this quite a bit where I have an odd, doesn't actually go into my brush when I move to the other side. Maybe that's something with my keyboard. I have no idea. Anyways, we can add with a brush here and start to paint those in. Chances are it'll probably work for you better than it actually works for me because clearly I have a sticky key somewhere. So instead of a brush, we're going to add a gradient. So let's do a linear gradient. And we can just draw with this linear gradient, bring that up. And this is going to allow us to add these clarity adjustments to anything directly in the foreground. And I'm not so worried because we have so much smoke in the background. I'm not so worried about this actually kind of intersecting with that area a bit lower because the raptor is already going to be the main focus of this piece. So that's masking. There's a lot of different masks, a lot of different options that you can use. Would highly, highly, highly recommend that 3D artists start learning Camera Raw and getting into this. The reason for that is you can actually start to create different presets that you can use and then have actions that you can run to kind of auto composite your render layers if you render out the same layers every time. But you can auto composite your render layers and then use a preset at the end of it from Camera Raw that's going to give you a nice cohesive look. So if you have a client that is rendering, say, products, for example, and you need a series of images to all be cohesive, you can just set that up as an action and run the action and not have to worry about going into each individual file to do everything. And then just go back into the individual file to make small micro adjustments. You know, say maybe there's an area light that looks weird on the product from one angle, need to paint out a reflection, whatever. Yeah, it's definitely good to learn. So the preset section is going to be down towards the bottom of this right-hand menu. And this is going to allow you to kind of scroll through quite a bit of your presets. And so I believe this is probably the one that I used and then manipulated that you guys saw for the hero image for our session here. But this is how it's going to be done. You're going to be able to pop in and just start to go and live preview all of the different presets that you create, including down at the bottom, they have a bunch of standard presets that you're able to use. And so you can go through these, modify them, create your own presets. And the way that we're going to do that is the create preset button that's here, or Control-Shift-P. And now you can head in and name it, create a new group of your own. You'll see that I have quite a few of them here. That's how you're going to be able to create presets. So we'll head back up, select one of these. There we go. Click OK. Wait for that filter to do its thing. And there's our final image, right? So everything at this point is going to be building up to that final state. And hopefully this is all done quite a bit to show you various tools that you can use, because there's really no one way to do everything. So knowing a lot of these different tools and how to use them is definitely beneficial. So any questions at this point?
There is a comment from Ricky Sharp about the grain added to different layer. That's interesting because yes, you usually have more grain in the shadow than the highlights. It's a very neat trick.
Yeah, it's definitely. I do add grain. I won't lie. I add grain to a lot of my renders just overall. If it's personal work, like you'll never know on Instagram. So there's times like you'll see that it's there and a little bit of a breakup, but most people won't really notice if it's personal work and you just want to get it out. If it's something that's a bit higher quality, like a pro or like a portfolio piece, I'll take a little bit of time, do the extra work. People may notice. Two different types of portfolios. You have your client portfolio that is saying, hey, this is the general type of work I do if you're freelancing. If I'm doing like portfolio pieces for a specific company or a studio, a lot of times I'm looking specifically at what their outputs have looked like that's in their portfolio, like on their website. And a lot of times I pull cues from that as to like, whether I'm using chromatic aberration or not, whether I'm adding grain or if I'm not, different things in that case. So yeah, a few different ways to do it. A lot of different tools can achieve similar results. So yeah. Is there anything else that we need to cover? I feel like we did it in less than an hour and a half this week. I want a cookie. If anybody wants to send me a cookie, like send it over. All right.
I think that's that was pretty thorough.
Yeah. I feel like that was a lot. Like I might have to go back and rewatch that just to know what I covered. Like that was a pretty good one. So yeah.
Great session and on time, say Joshua. All right, so yeah, sure. I find it very interesting again to see. It reminds me, I have used a lot Lightroom when I was a photographer, and it just reminds me memories of when I was using it. And actually, it gives me. I want to use it again because it's so powerful. I mean, it makes sense with 3D because photography, 3D. Same combat, and I'm really surprised about the clarity, because the clarity on the bad lens can really destroy an image. And here, when you use the clarity, it was very nice overall because yes, we do have perfect lens in 3D. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I was kind of surprised. I won't lie. It's not often that I just take the clarity slider overall and just completely crank it because I've gotten used to a workflow of doing it locally. And it actually didn't look too bad. A lot of times it'll look bad, especially if it's on photos, but yeah.
Oh yeah.
Maybe just crank the slider for a minute and see if that looks good on your overall render and just ship it. Who knows? I may be wrong.
Anyway, that's very often what I do. I put the slider all the way up and then I decrease. But this way, I'm sure something is happening. And then I can just tweak to the right amount. And very often I go, crazy high. And then I lower it a lot, like 80% from the maximum. But this way, I know where I'm going.
Yeah, it's kind of, if you've ever composited like in Nuke, like we did what was called gamma slamming, where we just like throw a gamma node in, exposure node, and we just like slam the gamma to see like where things actually line up, as far as the lighting in your composite. And then you start to make adjustments from there and you tweak from there. It's kind of like a really nice, what we call in like photo compositing, it's a nice check layer, and compositing and retouching. So it allows you to check certain values of certain things. So when you're starting to work with, clarity or texture or any of that, slam the slider, see what happens, and then dial it back as needed.
Cool. Well, I think that's it.
Yeah. It kind of feels weird. Like, I don't know what to do. I feel like I have 20 minutes left.
Me too. Like we're on time. So yeah, we're not even in time. We're not that late.
Yeah, we're not that late.
Okay, well, thank you, Dustin, for all that. It was very interesting. I'm pretty eager to see the next episode. So what would it be about, actually, next week?
Oh, man. So next week, we're talking about the 32-bit side of compositing. And full transparency, it's pretty much the fastest route from getting our render in to looking nice enough to convert to 16-bit. So just in case anybody's curious about it, that's my workflow. But we'll be talking about how to rebuild your beauty render using the different render layers and things like that, rather than just compositing specifically off of a beauty pass. So there are benefits. If you're building everything up kind of from the ground up, you can tweak each individual layer and manipulate your beauty pass at kind of like an individual layer level versus just overall. So yeah, that's what's going on next week. And so we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about how to do the or use the ACES transform LUTs that were included in the download, so you can rebuild kind of that ACES look. Maybe talk about what my take is on that, whether or not I guess we've already talked about that. I'd like to use beauty compositing more often. Saves a lot of time. If you're in production and other people have to use your 3D composite file in Photoshop, that's more the route that I would take with the multi-layer compositing and full 32-bit workflow and so on. It's not always needed. Sometimes it is. So we'll talk a little bit more about it next week.
Yeah, cool. All right. So that's it. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and we will see you next week.
Sounds good. Bye, everyone.